Ranking the mainline Resident Evil games is one of those topics that feels simple on the surface but gets complicated the moment you actually sit down and think about it. This is a franchise that has reinvented itself multiple times, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of ambition, and sometimes because it simply didn't know what it wanted to be anymore. For some people, Resident Evil is fixed camera angles and tank controls. For others, it's over the shoulder action. For a newer generation, it's first person horror. All of those perspectives are valid, and that's why I want to be clear right up front about where I'm coming from with this ranking. This list is based on the mainline Resident Evil games as I personally experienced them, focusing on the original versions rather than the modern remakes, and excluding Resident Evil Village, which I haven't played yet. This isn't meant to be the definitive ranking of the series or an objective truth carved into stone. It's a snapshot of how these games land for me, based on how they play, how they feel, and how well they represent what Resident Evil is supposed to be at their core. At the very bottom of the list is Resident Evil 6, a game that represents the absolute breaking point of the series' identity crisis. By the time Resident Evil 6 came out, it felt like Capcom was no longer sure what Resident Evil even was, let alone what it should be. The game is massive to a fault, with multiple campaigns that drag on far longer than they need to, each one leading harder into spectacle than tension. The focus is overwhelmingly on explosions, quick time events, and cinematic chaos, to the point where any sense of atmosphere or dread is completely smothered. Horror doesn't have room to breathe here because the game never slows down long enough to let it. Even mechanically, the game feels unfocused, constantly throwing new systems and ideas at the player without fully committing to any of them. While there are moments where you can see flashes of interesting concepts, they're buried under excess. Resident Evil 6 isn't just a bad Resident Evil game, it's a game that feels embarrassed by its own roots, and that's why it sits firmly at the bottom. Above that is Resident Evil 2. Now, I know this placement is going to raise some eyebrows. Resident Evil 2 is undeniably important, and its influence on the series cannot be overstated. Raccoon City is iconic, the idea of parallel campaigns was ambitious, and the game expanded the scope of the franchise beyond the confines of a single mansion. That said, when I look back at the original version specifically, it doesn't resonate with me as strongly as other entries. The pacing can feel inconsistent, and while the police station is an all time great location, the experience starts to lose some of its impact on repeat visits. The gameplay is solid, but it doesn't grip me the way later titles do. And while I appreciate what Resident Evil 2 did for the series, appreciation doesn't always equal personal enjoyment. It's a classic, no question, but for me, it lands lower than most people would expect. Next is the original Resident Evil, the game that laid the foundation for everything that followed. The Spencer Mansion remains one of the most atmospheric settings in gaming history, and the game's emphasis on limited resources, deliberate movement, and environmental storytelling still works conceptually. There's a purity to the original Resident Evil that's hard to ignore. Every door feels dangerous, every hallway feels tense, and the game constantly reminds you how fragile you are. At the same time, it's impossible to ignore how dated it feels mechanically. The stiff combat, the famously rough voice acting, and the trial and error design elements make it harder to revisit compared to later entries. I respect the original Resident Evil immensely, and I'm glad it exists, but respect alone isn't enough to push it higher on this list. Moving up, we get to Resident Evil 5, a game that often gets lumped together with Resident Evil 6 despite being a very different experience. Resident Evil 5 is where the series fully embraces action, but unlike its successor, it does so with focus and polish. The co op fundamentally changes how the game plays, turning encounters into strategic engagements rather than chaotic messes. The controls are tight, the pacing is strong, and the game knows exactly what it wants to be. While it sacrifices horror almost entirely, it makes up for it with consistency and replayability. Resident Evil 5 may not scare you, but it's confident, well made, and far more enjoyable than it often gets credit for. It represents the point where action heavy Resident Evil still worked. Just above that is Resident Evil 3, a game that takes the classic formula and injects it with urgency. Nemesis is one of the most effective threats the series has ever produced, not because of complex storytelling, but because of how he fundamentally alters players' behavior. You're never fully comfortable in Resident Evil 3, and that constant pressure keeps the experience intense from start to finish. The game is shorter than Resident Evil 2, but it's also tighter and more focused. It doesn't waste time and it doesn't let the player settle into a rhythm. Resident Evil 3 feels like the classic era pushed to its most aggressive extreme, and that's what makes it stand out. In second place is Resident Evil 4, a game that didn't just change Resident Evil but changed the industry. This is a game that knows exactly what it's doing from the moment it starts. The over the shoulder camera was revolutionary, the pacing is nearly flawless, and every encounter feels carefully designed. Resident Evil 4 isn't traditional survival horror, but it maintains tension through smart enemy design, limited resources, and constant forward momentum. It's confident, creative, and endlessly replayable. While it did steer the franchise away from its horror roots, it did so with such precision that's impossible to deny how effective it is. At the top of the list, my number one Resident Evil game is Resident Evil 7. This is the game that brought the series back from the edge. After years of escalating action, Resident Evil 7 strips everything down to vulnerability and fear. The first person perspective makes the horror feel immediate and personal, and the Baker House is one of the most unsettling locations the franchise has ever created. The game understands that horror isn't about constant threats, but about tension, atmosphere, and uncertainty. Resource management matters again. Exploration matters again. Resident Evil 7 just doesn't feel like a return to form. It feels like a reminder of why the series mattered in the first place. If you enjoyed this ranking and got something out of it, I'd really appreciate it if you gave the video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and rang the notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads. And if you want to go a step further and support the channel directly, check out my Patreon, where the latest exclusive takes a deep dive into the rise and fall of the Sega Dreamcast. Until next time, game on.